Yep. Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of whatever the fuck this is called. That actually might be a cool ass name for it.
Yeah, probably not as PG as most, but yeah, let's roll with that.
Yeah. Basically, what this is at some point in time, someone realized that we're having a lot of, I think, very useful conversations behind the scenes, but not a lot of them maybe aren't being had in front of the scenes. And I guess in the time where you can upload your opinions on anything to the interwebs for everyone to see, we thought, well, here's what the world needs: more opinions.
Yeah.
So today, our first guest in what will hopefully be a series is Khulekani Magubane.
Hello.
Yes, a young thought leader, if you will, a brother with many ideals and many things to say. So let's get into it. I wanted to talk, the other day you sent me a piece about Black radicalism, or by a Black radical. And it was more about, Black radicalism versus Black liberalism. That kind of got the juices flowing. First, just give us a bit of context behind the piece, if you would not mind.
Okay, so the piece was done by a doctor, Yassine, and it was published on Al Jazeera. Just to be clear, Al Jazeera did put a disclaimer that it doesn't reflect the thoughts and opinions of editorial. He's PhD, and he is basically making his own assessment of how things are in light of the recent protests in the United States over the death of George Floyd. And one of the things, what he does with this article, I believe it was called Black Liberal We See. And what he does with this article is he takes aim at this idea that collaboration broadly amongst the different groupings within Black America might be happening at the expense of the progress that's needed because, in America, white supremacy has worked to co-opt Blackness and co-opt Black individuals into that view of thinking, even in benign ways, to the point where when Black Americans of the liberal persuasion start to speak on these issues, they speak in diffused terms. So when people say that they want X, Black liberals will say Y is the ultimate objective. So he feels like it kind of softens the poignancy of the movement by Black radicals, for example. And it's come to a point where there are groups of people who believe that a peaceful life in America for Black Americans under the current prevailing system is just not possible, so that the system now needs to be done away with completely, while there are others who want to bargain and see what kind of gains can be made. And they offer things like police reform, or a safer police, or better police training, or community engagement. Whereas Black radicals are saying, nope, this is not enough. And just to say, the writer of this piece is also a proponent of a movement that's gathering steam in the United States and is starting to appear here for the abolition of police and prisons, which is going to be a very interesting issue to unpack and look into as we debate it as time goes on. I think you will agree with me that both in the American context and in the South African context, policing and prisons have existed very much at the expense of Black life. And that's something that's definitely going to need to be unpacked and looked at. I don't have the answers to the questions, as Justin Hunt would say, but when I read this piece, it just the like I said when I shared it with you, the rage was visceral. Like, this is we can talk about the merits and right and wrong and delusional and lucid or correct and righteous at another time. This person was angry, and that's why it really sprang up for me.
I mean, I find that it's useful, I think, for you that you sent it, and we'll put the link in the bio. But like, I always find it interesting that is, so whenever these things happen, like, people obviously get angry, and eventually at some point, the discussion does always become like, oh, Martin or Malcolm, because obviously then you get kind of the thing where people will start dropping all the Martin Luther King quotes and the Desmond Tutu quotes, especially, oh good Lord. And it'll be like, hey, this peaceful thing, and it sort of becomes, and you have the other side of that discussion where people like the fourth are saying, no, fuck that, we are angry, let's burn the whole fucking thing down.
Yeah.
And the discussion always pops up about whether it's better to be a liberal and be sort of slowly, let's progress, look at how far we've come, look at the steps we've made, as opposed to a radical who'll say something like, the system is not designed for you. The only way this works is to break it down. And I guess, for one thing, I want to find out, where do you stand then in that whole thing? And is that whole thing even a healthy discussion to be having?
The first thing that I want to point out is I feel like in every healthy democracy that doesn't pay lip service to the idea of democracy, dissent, and yes, chaos that might come with dissent is an essential part of democracy. Because democracy does not assume a moral high ground. A democracy that respects dissent does not assume a moral high ground of saying, we give you a voice once every 4 or 5 years. We can't be wrong. In between elections, in between by-elections, in between local governments elections, in between JSC commission hearings and interviews, we have windows of opportunity that might not be democratic in the official sense, but we have the mechanisms through which we can say there's something in the system and it's not working. At least it's not working for us. So there's that, but I think this goes a step further, and it goes to a point of not just questioning how the system works, but questioning the very system's right to exist. And I can only speak from what I know because I am not an American, obviously. But if we're talking about 4 centuries of not being able to have humanity recognized regardless of the systems that are put in place, Jim Crow South gave protest as a mechanism for Negroes to express themselves. Whereas white Americans could go through the courts and get things done. We've had the past few years of drama in the NFL with Colin Kaepernick kneeling. We've had activism on social media with movements such as Black Lives Matter. And at every single turn, with every single attempt, people are stonewalled, they're gaslit, they're told that they're looking at the wrong things, they're told that they're overly sensitive, they're told that they're delusional. And it only...
You just muted yourself.
Sorry about that.
My bad. Now we're good.
You can only go so far and so long down that trajectory before people start to say, maybe we haven't been seeing the forest for the trees. And it does not surprise me one bit that there are some amongst the radicalist movements, amongst the protesters, amongst the demonstrators, amongst the activists that are questioning America's very right to exist. And I say, now is as good a time as any to have the conversation. I don't know if anything gets done after that, because, unbundling this system that took centuries to put together, that was put together with the hand of the oppressed people, it's not something that's just going to unfold. But the conversation definitely needs to be had. Like, how much longer do you defend an unjust system? And what the implications of that are.
Is it time for, because it feels to me like the conversation's been had. The same kind of things basically, and like, you're right, you can only really speak from what you know, but the same kind of things that are being discussed were the same things being discussed when Huey Newton and co were forming the Black Panthers. They were the same things being discussed just after slavery, when it was like, all right, look, bro, we've come out of the system. These guys are clearly not our friends. How do we do this? And I suppose I can sort of see where the radical would go. So every time this discussion comes up, or there is a conflagration of some sort, it happens, the drama happens, and then acceptable people sit with the powers that be and say, okay, and the powers that be say, we'll dole out a little bit of what you ask for. We'll give you legal rights to vote without necessarily changing the structure of what the system is like. So like, for instance, here, like, structural inequality still exists even though we are all equal. And
but that
yeah,
I'll continue.
No, and so in my mind, it makes me wonder if maybe at some point the conversation kind of becomes circular in that it's okay, fuck you guys, we're going to do this big grand revolutionary thing, but then each time that's said, eventually it sort of fizzles out. Yes, also the leaders of such organizations tend to get assassinated, but yeah, and then we find ourselves back here in a generation or two.
And I think that's the very same frustration that animates the conversations that are happening now. Because in comparison, what we've seen before in demands have been concessions rather than a complete overhaul. And I think radicals feel like they've been all these years chasing concessions within this bubble. And the bubble is always going to be oppressive. So the bubble kind of needs to rupture. That's the sense that I'm getting from a lot of people who are of the radical persuasion. I remember checking out a great docuseries on the O.J. Simpson trial. And if you remember how that trial was basically took on a life of its own as this issue of race and justice in America. And I remember one of the journalists during the trial interviewed a Black man outside of the courts who said, out of all of this, people are gathering and protesting for this man's freedom. That might be why you're here, but my fear is that people out in Iowa and Middle America who don't interact with Black Americans will start to get the wrong idea about us and start to feel like this is who we are. And that would be very unfortunate for the image of the Black man and the beating that it's taken Oh, sorry. Pardon me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he pretty much said it would be unfortunate for the image of the black man and the beating that it's taken after we've worked so hard to prove that we're not all criminals. And that was some 25, 30 years ago, still 25 years ago. Something tells me that the people that are marching out there in the various cities of the United States, their primary concern is not about whether white America looks at them and sees criminals. Otherwise, these protests wouldn't be happening.
Mm.
I think the concern is now gone to a fundamental level of humanity and the decency of humanity that is inherent in all of us. And I feel like that's what's foremost, as opposed to incidences where a news event takes place and people use it to try and advance racial justice in America. And it seems like there's a straw man that you're trying to, defend. That is the image or the idea that you can live wherever you want to live or can afford to live, regardless of what you look like, or that you have representation in boardrooms. But that it's right now, this strikes me as a very as a fight that's for the very fundamental inherent decency of humanity. But who knows what's going to happen as a result? You rightly say, a generation from now, we might still be talking about this. But the debate has evolved so much with very little progress and gains. And at some point, the penny's got to drop.
Okay, to jump to the other side of the fence for a second here. I feel a lot of, in the same way that now I'm saying, in the previous question, I said like a lot of black radicals would argue there's not very much progress that has been made, despite the fact that this has been going on for a while. I feel a lot of whoever we're calling black liberals could argue that, like, well, especially in a context like America's, where black people are a minority, and it is actually only so far you can push the state before it says you are a threat to our existence, and there are more of us than there are of you, and if need be, we can't just get rid of you. Or we don't want to. I don't think it's a drastic solution, but if you're looking at a country where black people, 13% of the population?
Yeah.
I do think can exist a fear that, look, the state it does have a lot of leverage in a situation like that. It's not like in South Africa where we're the majority, so at some point in time, you kind of have to play ball. And so I think they're like, a black people might say, we are taking steps that are realistic. We're going for achievable goals. There's no point trying to shoot for the moon with a handgun.
It's very interesting when it's put that way. And I think that's probably where the challenge lies, is that there are a broad set of beliefs amongst all the people that have aligned themselves with these protests. And a lot of them are saying, like you, let us see what we can gain from this moment as it stands now. And there are other people who would, as you're saying, shoot for the moon. But when you bring the demographics of the United States into it, I think that word threat really rings so it resonates very powerfully with me because people haven't started feeling threatened when people started protesting on the streets. I think a lot of people, policymakers, politicians in the United States know that before this generation is out, the demographics in the United States are going to change dramatically. The statistics are pointing to a predominantly Hispanic America. Hispanic Americans will become the leading race in America in the coming decades, if nothing in the population dynamics changes. And the population of the white population in the United States of America is slowing down in growth and is aging. And that's why you've got things like the marches, the tiki torch marches by the extreme right movements chanting about we will not be replaced, because that's the existential threat that exists in the psyche of Americans, which some would argue Donald Trump has energized and mobilized and ignited. And these are people who are fighting to have their country back, so to speak. And they are diametrically opposed to the group of people who are telling themselves, we never had a country to begin with. And it becomes increasingly difficult to preach about concessions, to preach about small gains, to preach about what can we win. And that's, but the problem is not everybody sees things exactly the same way amongst the protesters. And protest is messy like that, you know. I'm not going to call the protesters looters because they don't all go out there with the exact same thing in mind in practical terms. We do understand that there have been police officers who've been seen out there damaging property, looting stores. I mean, no one knows what it's about, but to the untrained eye, it looks like a bid to frame protesters. We have seen people who have joined in the protests innocently and have brought damage to property and have been scolded for doing it. Especially if you look at low-income communities. You've seen medical dispensaries that give medication to those suffering from mental health problems at a subsidized price. You see those getting gutted and looted. You see power bank stands that homeless people use to charge their phones destroyed. You see stores, corner shops owned by immigrants gutted, looted, and that really just speaks to what might be happening within that circle, and in the fog of war, and in a legitimate cry for what needs to happen. And that's something that they're going to have to navigate in time, certainly with the help of every ally that they win. But then again, there are some who are not interested in the idea of allyship because they feel like it might crowd the overall intention and say, this is what we ultimately want, but the people that are standing next to us will settle for something less. And what I think is, it's definitely going to come to bear. But if this ends in some sort of concession, I mean, this is not even about, Derek Chauvin getting convicted ultimately in the end for a lot of people. This isn't about, police reform at the end of the day for some people. There are people who fundamentally want things done away with, whether it's prisons or it's police departments altogether. There's a grand prize to be won, but but not everybody that's protesting might see it that way, and that's what makes it complicated.
That kind of thing, because I sort of wanted to jump into what you were talking about a bit earlier with the protesting, like where, you know, some people are protesting peacefully and some people are not. And it always sort of brings up, I mean, it's a discussion that happens here often, but this idea of how you should or shouldn't protest. What is the best way to go about it? I never quite know what to say to that, because you get those protests that are like the ones that go through Parkhurst where, you know, all the white ladies like behave and they sing and they're like, oh yeah. Well, and all of those tend to look to me like an exercise in peacocking. Like we're in these streets, but we're not fundamentally threatening anything. We're just all taking a big walk in the sun together. The thing we're protesting is not looking at us going, oh, this is dangerous to my existence. It's just, people don't like whatever it is I'm doing, that's fine. Let them walk. And I think that's kind of, for me anyway, where it always goes to with like protests. Protest has to be threatening in some way. That's kind of this like raison d'etre. It's like I am protesting whatever this police brutality. I can't protest violence peacefully. Or at least it seems to me that way. Like, how do I peacefully sort of stand and say, I have no intentions of hurting you or any of the mechanisms that prop you up, while you are killing me? I just find that makes it confuses me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I agree with you. I'm not sure we should be calling people looters or whatever, but I think if you don't have to loot by any means, but if you find yourself outside Louis Vuitton with some matches and you're like, maybe we should burn it, then maybe burn it. Maybe I was watching the 13th again, and it sort of just reframed a lot of stuff. Because I mean, like you're saying, and like a lot of people are suggesting, the whole police system and structure was not designed around the idea to protect and serve. It was designed more around the idea of, we need prison labor, or we need it. It has a much darker sort of reason for being, and because of that, like, trying to march and say, oh, we need this thing to recognize our humanity is, or if that's the only sort of thing we're then doing, like if we're saying, okay, like this protest will get them to eventually recognize our humanity, it feels to me like you kind of missed the point that the system doesn't have eyes. It's not supposed to see your humanity. It's not supposed to be involved. And I remember, because in the 13th, they keep bringing up the 13th Amendment. And it's kind of fascinating for me that, like, this isn't spoken about more, but like the 13th Amendment basically says that we abolish slavery unless we arrest you. Then yes, you can be a slave. And corporations in America use prison labor. They use slave labor to get shit done. And so if you're burning a JCPenney or a Victoria's Secret, that is a cog in the machine that doesn't, because Victoria's Secret, if they're using prison labor, they're never going to look at you and go, there is a human. They're looking at you going, there is a worker. There is a potential worker. They're looking at prisoners not as people, but as, I don't know, whatever factory tools they have. And so, yeah, I don't think you can protest. Or I don't think you can protest peacefully, but it always feels to me like the calls for peaceful protest are I don't know what the word is, but the maybe not always helpful, because it sort of suggests that you can get the state to take you seriously without threatening it, and I don't think you can.
I'm pretty glad that you brought that up, and I do feel like because of the way that we interact with protest, there can be a lot of misrepresentation that goes on. First of all, when I see people get outraged at the actions of protesters in situations like these, I kind of get delighted, because that's the first goal achieved. Because if a protest is underpinned by oppression, then it's supposed to make the oppressor uncomfortable. It's like, you're uncomfortable, you're angry, you're sad, good. Now you know how some people out here feel. And it's also important to note that, like, again, because of how we interact with protest, we have a very strange relationship with it, because even in the South African context, like, we tend to think protests are violent, but it is the stark minority of protests that turn violent. And even in that violence, the demonstrators are seldom, almost never, the aggressors. And what becomes critical is to notice the role of the police. And you rightly say, like, the police have a social contract with us that persuades us that they're there to protect us, but they're really there to uphold the law. And whether that means that you get protected by implication is something that's informed by so many things, including whether you're on the right side of the law or not, how much social capital you got, and that is what kind of brings that kind of interesting complication. You know, your peaceful protests do occur, and they're very common when the stakes are not terribly high. But, you know, for so many people, a protest is a means of communication, not even a means of expressing a grievance anymore. It's like there are some communities in South Africa where you can't get a person to come to your community unless something is burning. And that's the problem, is that there's people who complain about things. They'll go to the mayoral office, and they'll complain about something. They'll say, maybe the complaint is, yo, we don't have street lights, and we live far away from the economic hub of our community. So many of our people come home late in the dark. There are mothers who are walking home for 15 kilometers in the dark. Do something. And then the answer is, send that to us in writing. And then go back to the drawing board. You come back, you've got a letter, you've got a memorandum. And it's, okay, we'll take this, but the mayor is not available right now. Maybe if you come back next week and remind us, we'll get straight to it. And then back, you return a week later, it's a different receptionist. Oh, the receptionist went on leave and didn't pass the memo on to the mayor. You have to give us a chance to get all our ducks in a row. Please come back next week. And then, it's the belittling and the diminishing of these things. And then nobody's doing anything, nothing gets done, no one gets listened to. But as soon as the tire starts burning, you've got the mayor, you've got the MEC, you've got the premier, you've got a minister, all rushing to do damage control. And that just shows you that, when we transitioned into the democratic dispensation, we didn't create and establish healthy lines of communication that are effective for people. And then we wonder why they behave the way they do. It's because we've cornered them into a situation where it's like, your needs are not acknowledged, they're not validated. What else am I supposed to do? I know this is the only way that you respond to me. And I mean, there are people who have the social capital and don't have to wreck things in order to get attention. But I'm not going to criticize and blame people if that's the only way that those who claim to be accountable to them are going to listen. Like, I say go ahead and do it. I mean, if you have a bit of social capital, of course, you can march, you can have a sit-in or a picket with some signs, and you will be acknowledged. Your memorandum will be taken, and it will be responded to in 9 working days. But a lot of us don't have the luxury of being seen as human in that way.
And I think that ties in very nicely with what you were talking about when you mentioned allyship. Because it's often allies who will say, yes, guys, but maybe we need to look at this protest and see how we can make it more peaceful, make it like, and sort of sit in your ear and say X, Y, and Z. And I'm, especially this time round, I'm in a little bit of a weird space about allies, because one wonders if they are actually useful. If you're like, and I suppose they are if you're trying to get sort of like incremental gains, but invariably the problem with allies is that they are beneficiaries of the system. And so I mean, it's cool and it's nice when you guys are at a protest and they're standing beside you saying, this system is terrible. But then when it comes to the point where you now as the oppressed people are advocating for things to rip down the system, it feels like at some point they realize, oh wait, this is my shit. Hold on, what if instead of we just did it a little bit like this? I mean, Helensville is a wonderful case in point. Oh, I like her. She's a walking example, because she was there. She was an ally. She was, if you ask her, she will tell you she was in the front lines facing down bullets, whatever the case may be. I don't know. But she was, for all intents and purposes, an ally, and what ally should be. She is now sort of the poster child for white privilege. She is, and she behaves in exactly the ways people are like, this is the problem. Everything that you are doing now is the problem. And yeah, again, I wonder if you can, because you're really asking allies to give up a lot because of the system. Like, they like it. It benefits them, of course. So,
yeah.
And it also benefits them to look like a morally upright person by being on your side. Like, so you get to play both sides of the fence, which I don't think, and that's why I think it ends up often being counterproductive. I mean, if you look again in this country at something like BEE. Now, is BEE the perfect system? No. Could it be made better? I'm sure it could be. But oftentimes, the biggest pushback you get from about a program that is ostensibly to improve the lot of Black people is from white people who voted for the ANC or were in struggle plays or whatever it was that they did back in the day. Like, and they're like, no, but this is reverse racism. Yes, it's not your place to tell us what it is or isn't. Like, Chad, we don't actually care. But you see, and that's the thing. So Chad will always, and those are probably the voices that meant that BEE didn't go far enough. Because they were in there saying, no, but listen, this now affects me. Oh, I can't get a job. Oh, I can't. Oh, and I really hate that argument just because it's patently untrue. Oh my God, white men can't get jobs. Jesus. Jesus. Have you seen any workplace? Like, really? But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So yeah, I haven't formulated an opinion yet, but I do find that I'm starting to look at allies and their role in whatever is happening a little suspiciously, and think maybe for a while you should just sit in the corner, let what needs to happen happen, and then we'll call you back.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head, honestly. I don't know how much I can add to it, but especially when we look at what's going on right now in the States, for example. And I think allyship can definitely be useful because it kind of gives a perspective. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Patriot Act Hassan Minaj's latest video. He pretty much has like a rolling montage of people from Fox News condemning what happened to George Floyd, and he rounds it off with Logan freaking Paul talking about.
Oh, you muted again.
And you know, I find myself.
He ends up with.
Huh?
You were saying he ends up with no good.
Logan Paul.
Oh yes, yeah.
Basically talking about how it's an injustice and a travesty, and it's like you think to yourself, "Fuck! If Logan Paul gets it, like, what is your excuse?" I do think that there's a lot that can go pear-shaped about, you know, putting allies at the front and in terms of strategizing and organizing and mobilizing. I think they can participate. I mean, it was, you know, Malcolm X spoke about allyship himself. He said, you know, whites can help us, but they can't join us, you know. A lot of things can go pear-shaped, you know, like, and I do get why it's appealing. There's a great kind of, you know, there's a great kind of like white Messiah syndrome that can be, you know, satisfied amongst some who would want to lend a hand. You know, the white Messiah complex is something that dates back so many years, you know. And honestly, I think a lot of people are just trying to use this legitimate process. A lot of allies are trying to use this legitimate process of protest to live out their Joker fantasies. I see a lot of that. I do think the overwhelming majority of them do care. I do think the majority of them care. But there comes a point where you have to reckon about your place, about your about how much authority you can assume morally and organizationally. And I would urge every single ally, the first thing you need to do is listen. You know, like don't go look for your black friend and ask them to explain it to you, because it's not an oppressed person's job to teach you how you're being oppressive. Don't do that. But when the opportunity arises and they've got something to say, listen. And then you play the role accordingly, I think. I think, you know, when again, when I see the issue of, you know, police officers caught on camera damaging property, like, the reasonable mind tells you they're trying to sabotage and diminish the cause by doing that, because it portrays the protesters as violent. And, you know, a lot of those who are jumping on cars, smashing windshields and I'm not talking about whether I believe it's right or wrong to do that. because that's a conversation for another day. But a lot of those that are beating those windshields into the cars, they're Codys and Karens and Kyles, you know.
Yes, the Karens of the world are whiling.
They're going hard in the paint. But I sit there and I ask myself, okay, did you speak to people before it got to that point? Because I'm having a bit of a problem with the implications of what you're doing for people that are around you, that are protesting, that don't look like you. Because when the cops come in and they sweep up with the tear gas and the pepper spray, they're not going to be looking for Cody and Kyle. They're going to be looking for Jamal, you know? And that's something that just needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about allies. And I do hope that, you know, the EQ dials up a bit. That, you know, you feel like you're saving the world. It feels like the end of the world, and it's intoxicating, I know. But the sun rises after the fog of war is settled, and there will be consequences often. I hate the fact that that's the case, but there will be. But don't be the person that pushes the dial right to the end game and then go back to your townhouse or your luxury apartment or your Ivy League university dorm and tell yourself you did something.
Big fact. Okay, well said. I love that. Final thing then, before we wrap up, and I'm going to ask an incredibly pointless and reductive question.
Yeah.
Fine. So, which is better, being a liberal or the radical?
I'm actually delighted that we can even have this conversation right now, because I think there's definitely a day of reckoning coming for Black liberals and liberals in general. I'm going to stiff you, man. I'm not going to answer the question. But what I will say is that the liberal has had a field day defining politics for Black Americans. And I think it has come to a point where it's got to stop. I mean, celebrities are not the be-all and end-all of the political discourse. But I remember when Chance the Rapper was criticized, they laid into him for saying something as innocent as, you know what? Being Black doesn't necessarily have to preclude that you're liberal. You know? Not all Black people have to be Democrats.
Yeah.
And it was outrageous, the amount of criticism that he got. And he eventually had to dial back and apologize for that. And that spirit of entitlement by liberals to Black support has always been there, and it's so palpable. And that's why the other week you had Joe Biden responding to a Black American voter who said he was torn about who to vote for between Trump and Biden. Now, that's another conversation for another day. But for Joe Biden to figuratively stick his finger in that Black man's face and say, if you don't know who to vote for between me and Trump, you're not Black.
Yeah.
It was, and he's apologized since for it, so we'll shoot him bail for that. But it just speaks to the spirit of arrogance, breathtaking arrogance, by liberals and Black liberals to kind of assume this and try and wrest Black people's support out of their own hands. And to be a white man that questions a Black man's Blackness because of his political decisions is the peak of liberal arrogance. And if I had to choose one, I'm going to choose the one that doesn't presume that they have my support just because of conventional politics. Because to be Black is a complex thing. You know, I've been asking myself a lot the past few days, how is being Black so amazing but so hard? And politics needs to become less naive to that reality and start like the allies, to listen, to dial up that EQ. That's all I have to say on that, man.
That's a cool thing. You're actually entirely right to re-reference the 13th, but I remember one of the things they said in the beginning, I can't remember who said it, but he said, if you look at the Black experience in America, the like sort of theme that runs through it is just to be looked at and considered as a complex human being, which I thought was some powerful shit. But thanks, man. Thank you for who knows? Maybe we'll do this again. I have enjoyed this. I think it's been fruitful.
I've enjoyed it too. Yeah. Yeah.
And thanks, man. Good luck.
Thank you so much, man. Have a good day, man.
You too, man. Peace.
Easy.